James Walker had never been one for extravagance. He liked his coffee strong, his routine steady, and his life simple. After all, that's how he built Walker Auto and Repair from a rusted-out garage on the edge of Dayton into a respected small business. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Every cent he earned came from years of grit, busted knuckles, and long days that turned into longer nights. So when the cream-colored envelope arrived, thick, embossed, and perfumed, he knew immediately it didn't belong in his world. He turned it over in his calloused hands, the gold lettering catching the morning light. It was from his daughter, Emily. Well, technically, it was from Emily and Charles Hawthorne III. That name alone carried weight. The Hawthornes were old money, the kind of family that had entire wings of hospitals named after them, the kind of people who ordered wine without checking the price, because they'd funded the vineyard. James sat down at his kitchen table, the invitation unopened in front of him. His heart thudded in a mix of pride and something colder, harder to name. He hadn't heard from Emily directly in weeks, months, really. Since the engagement was announced, most of their communication had come through her mother, Lisa, or filtered through social media posts that made James feel like a spectator to his own daughter's life. Still, he opened it. The calligraphy was flawless. The wedding would take place at the Hawthorne estate in Connecticut, a sprawling mansion he had seen only once, back when Lisa remarried and took Emily with her. James was invited to the rehearsal dinner, the ceremony, and the black tie reception to follow. Everything was printed with an elegance that didn't feel like Emily, but maybe he didn't know her well enough anymore to say. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Black tie, he muttered. Jesus. The weeks that followed were a blur of awkward fittings and unfamiliar decisions. James hated shopping, but he let Taylor talk him into a rented tuxedo that made him feel like a penguin with a wrench. He got his boots polished, shaved more often, even practiced how he'd greet Charles without punching him in the face. Because no matter how much he loathed the man, he wouldn't ruin Emily's wedding. That was the promise he made himself every night leading up to the event. He drove to Connecticut in his old Ford truck, the kind that coughed every time it climbed a hill and refused to die. As he pulled through the wrought iron gates of the Hawthorne estate, he felt like he'd entered another world. The lawn was manicured like a golf course, hedges sculpted into perfect symmetry, and the mansion loomed like a cathedral to privilege. He parked far from the other guests' sleek black cars and luxury sedans, walking toward the main house with a garment bag slung over his shoulder. The staff at the door hesitated just a second too long before letting him in. Inside, it smelled like roses and wealth. He found Emily in one of the sitting rooms, radiant and nervous in a sea of pearls and ivory lace. She hugged him tightly, and for a brief, perfect moment, the years melted away. She was still his little girl, and he was still her dad. But then Charles entered the room, all polished charm and tailored arrogance, and the temperature dropped. James, Charles said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Glad you could make it. I trust the GPS worked all right out here. Emily laughed, missing the undercurrent. James just nodded, his jaw tightening. That night, at the welcome dinner, James was seated at a table with strangers. Lisa barely acknowledged him, too wrapped up in her new life of social climbing and tennis clubs. Emily was swept up in speeches, toasts, and endless congratulations. James clinked his glass a few times, hoping to catch her eye, but she never looked his way long enough. And then, toward the end of the evening, the MC announced that Charles Hawthorne himself would be saying a few words. The room fell silent as he stood. James watched as Charles took the microphone with a practiced smile, his hand resting lightly on Emily's back. Family, Charles began, is more than blood. It's about legacy, about building something greater than ourselves. James tuned out the rest, staring at the flame of the centerpiece candle. He didn't belong here. He wasn't part of this carefully curated life. But he would stay, for Emily, no matter what it cost. And so, in that gilded room filled with polished silverware and delicate laughter, James made a silent vow. He would not let this wedding erase him. He would be present. He would be proud. And he would be damned if he let a man like Charles Hawthorne rewrite the story of who he was, or what kind of father he had been. He just didn't know then that by the end of it, he wouldn't need to raise his voice to make Charles fall. He'd only need to be patient. and the truth would do the rest. The rehearsal dinner was held in the Hawthorne Estate South Hall, a room that could have doubled as a museum. Ornate chandeliers spilled golden light onto long tables dressed in ivory linen. A string quartet played softly near the fireplace, and servers in white gloves floated between guests with trays of hors d'oeuvres James couldn't even pronounce. It was elegance tailored to intimidate, and it did its job well. James had arrived early, wearing the best suit he owned. It was charcoal gray, modestly cut, with a subtle pinstripe he thought looked dignified. He had picked it years ago for a business award dinner, and it still fit him well enough. He adjusted the cuffs, checked his tie in a hallway mirror, and walked into the room determined to keep his composure. He wasn't greeted. No one even offered him a drink. Around him, couples clinked glasses and shared muted laughter. It was the kind of event where last names mattered more than first impressions. He saw Lisa from across the room, draped in a pale blue gown, her hand resting on Charles's arm. She noticed James and gave a polite smile, distant, like an echo from a different life. Emily was busy talking with her bridal party, so James found a quiet seat near the far end of the table. It wasn't long before Charles took the center of attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles said, raising a glass of vintage champagne, "thank you all for being here tonight. This weekend marks not just a union of two people, but a joining of two families. Some of us have come from very different paths to arrive at this moment." James didn't flinch. He knew that was aimed at him, but he kept his eyes forward, hands resting calmly in his lap. "Now," Charles continued, pausing for effect, "I must say, it takes a certain kind of courage to come into a room like this wearing confidence instead of couture." A few scattered laughs broke out. James felt the air shift. "And James," Charles said, turning directly toward him, "your suit, wherever it came from, wears you quite well." This time, the laughter was fuller, sharper. Someone even coughed into their drink. James didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply reached for the glass of water in front of him and took a sip. The silence that followed was louder than the laughter. "Thanks, Charles," James said, voice low but steady. "You know, I've always believed that style can't be bought, but clearly some still try." The table closest to him went quiet. A few heads turned, but Charles only chuckled and moved on, continuing his toast as if nothing had happened. The rest of the evening went on under a thin layer of tension that James could feel pressing against his temples like a vice. Later, while guests mingled near the fireplace and the staff cleared plates with military precision, James stepped outside for air. The night was cool, the garden bathed in soft lights. He lit a cigarette, his first in over 6 months, and leaned on the stone railing of the terrace. He heard footsteps behind him. "Emily." "Dad," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry about what Charles said. That was uncalled for." James exhaled slowly. "He's just protecting his kingdom," he said. "A man like that doesn't see people like me as part of the decor. I don't fit." Emily frowned. "You don't have to fit. You're my dad." "That used to mean more," he said, flicking ash into the bushes. She sighed. "It still does. You know it does. But you can't just blow up. Please, not this weekend." James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Back inside, Charles was entertaining a group of men near the bar. James watched from the doorway. The way they laughed, leaned in, handed Charles their full attention. It reminded him of salesmen trying to impress a boss. The difference was, Charles wasn't their boss. He was their goal. James turned to leave when one of the groomsmen approached him, young, awkward, clearly tipsy. "Hey, you're the bride's dad, right?" the guy asked, nearly stumbling into James. "Yeah. She's awesome, man. Seriously, you raise her right." James smiled faintly. "Thanks. I just gotta say, I don't know how you do it. Like, standing in a room like this? Must be weird, huh?" James gave him a long look. "You ever fix a carburetor in the dead of winter with a flashlight in your mouth?" "No." "Then trust me, I've been in weirder places." The kid laughed nervously and wandered off. James stayed until the evening wound down, until the candles burned low and the laughter lost its polish. He waited for Emily to finish thanking the guests, watched her hug Charles goodnight, and then caught her eye one last time before leaving. She smiled at him, a real smile, and that made it bearable. He walked to his truck alone, the night crisp, the gravel crunching under his shoes. He sat behind the wheel, engine idling, hands gripping the steering wheel longer than necessary. It wasn't just a suit. It wasn't just a joke. It was a message. You're not one of us. But what Charles didn't know was that James had never wanted to be one of them. And now, he was sure of something deeper. Charles had underestimated him. That might have been the biggest mistake of his life. James lit one last cigarette, then crushed it beneath his heel before driving off into the dark. He had a wedding to attend tomorrow, and something told him the real ceremony hadn't even started yet. The morning of the wedding arrived shrouded in a gentle mist that clung to the edges of the Hawthorne estate like an omen dressed in silk. Inside, the mansion stirred quietly. Staff moved like shadows, preparing the final touches, polishing silver, adjusting flower arrangements, triple-checking guest lists. Everything had to be perfect. At least that was the illusion. James woke in the small, and he had booked for himself 10 minutes from the estate. He rose early, his back aching slightly from the stiff mattress, and stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He hadn't shaved. He didn't want to. There was a tension in his jaw now that made it hard to go through the motions. Something about the night before had embedded itself in him like a splinter. Not just the insult, but the way it had been delivered, calculated and casual, like a predator testing boundaries. He arrived at the estate just before noon, wearing the tuxedo he had rented, this time with the bow tie properly aligned and the jacket sitting squarely on his shoulders. He didn't need compliments. He didn't need approval. But what he needed, what had started to grow inside him, was clarity. He was walking through the garden toward the main hall when he caught something unexpected. Near the west veranda, behind a lattice of ivy, two men stood speaking in hushed tones. One was Charles. The other, a broad-shouldered man with a slick-back haircut and a thin, predatory smile. James slowed. Their voices weren't meant to carry, but the acoustics of the stone wall made them audible from a few steps away. "She'll be married by tonight, and then we're locked in," the stranger said. "The shares become hers officially. That gets us the leverage we need." Charles nodded. Her grandfather set the trust up to activate upon marriage. It was supposed to be a security net. Now it's our in. What about the father? He's a ghost. Has no idea what she's worth now, let alone the board seat she'll inherit. He thinks he's just here to walk her down the aisle and smile for the pictures. James stiffened. The other man laughed. "You're a cold bastard, Hawthorne." "I prefer efficient," Charles replied. "And once it's done, Emily can play house all she wants. But those votes go where I say." James backed away before they could see him. He moved through the garden quickly, his heart thudding, not with panic, but with fury. So it wasn't just ego. It wasn't about James being poor or inconvenient. It was about access, power. The wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a transaction, and Emily was the currency. He found himself near the stables, far from the main crowd. He needed air, needed space to think. His first instinct was to go straight to Emily, but what could he say? That her fiancé and his business partner were treating her like a walking stock portfolio? She would never believe it. Not today. Not without proof. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "You okay there, sir?" James turned. A young woman in a black blazer and headset stood a few feet away, holding a clipboard, probably part of the wedding coordination team. "Yeah," he muttered. "Just needed a break." She nodded. "You're the bride's father, right?" "James Walker." "That's me. I'm Julia. I'm managing vendor logistics, but I've got everyone's name memorized. It's a skill." He smiled faintly, then hesitated. "You've been working with the Hawthorns long?" "This is my second event here. First one was a charity gala." "Why?" James looked at her. Something about her eyes said she was sharp. Too sharp to buy into the performance happening upstairs. Have you ever heard Charles talk about business during events? Things that didn't sound quite right. Julia glanced around, lowered her voice. "He doesn't shut up about it. I once heard him refer to a nonprofit merger like it was a bank heist. Real charming guy. James stepped closer. If I told you I thought this wedding wasn't just about love, that it might be about money, would you think I was crazy? Julia tilted her head. If it's about the prenup, you're not the first person to question it. His blood chilled. What prenup? She blinked. I assumed you knew. There's a document. Saw it by accident yesterday. One of the groomsmen left a copy on a chair in the lounge. It was dense, but weird. A lot of emphasis on inheritance conditions, restrictions, clauses about company shares. James's mouth tightened. Could you give me a copy? I don't know. That stuff's locked up now. But let me ask around. Quietly. He nodded. Thanks. And Julia, don't trust anyone in that house. She gave a wry smile. Wouldn't dream of it. As she walked away, James felt a strange calm settle over him. There was something to fight now. Not just suspicion, not just resentment, but something concrete, something real, and he wasn't going to let it slide. He returned to the house, moving carefully through the hallways. Conversations blurred around him, laughter, champagne flutes clinking, distant calls from makeup artists and photographers. But he kept his focus tight. Outside the bridal suite, he saw Lisa speaking with the wedding planner. She noticed James and approached, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "You're not causing problems, are you?" she asked under her breath. "Not yet," he said. She narrowed her eyes. "You've got that look." "What look?" "The look you used to get when the transmission died, and we couldn't afford to fix it. You'd disappear for 3 days and come back with it running like new and a gash across your palm." James didn't smile. "You ever wonder why I did that?" Lisa's voice softened. "James, just let Emily have her day." "She can have a day," he said. "But I'll be damned if I let her lose her future." Lisa's mouth opened, then closed again. She said nothing as he walked past her. James entered the dressing area designated for the groomsmen. Empty now. He moved quietly, scanning the room. On the corner table, buried beneath bow ties and cufflinks, he spotted a folded folder labeled legal copies. He opened it. Empty. Too late, but not for long. Because if Charles thought this was still a game of appearances, he hadn't yet learned the one thing James had mastered from a life of being underestimated. When no one sees you coming, it's already too late. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but the mansion buzzed with activity from early morning. Staff glided down corridors with urgent grace. Decorators made last-minute adjustments, and the bridal suite was transformed into a whirlwind of hairspray, silk, and whispered excitement. James kept his distance, watching the movements like a man observing a play he hadn't auditioned for. He stood in one of the side parlors, overlooking the garden, hands in his pockets, back straight. The tuxedo felt tighter now, like it was resisting the man he'd become over the last 24 hours. He hadn't spoken to Emily since their brief exchange the night before, and though he didn't want to burden her with what he had heard behind the ivy wall, the weight of it pressed heavier with each passing hour. Lisa entered the room quietly, her heels muffled by the thick Persian rug. She looked immaculate, her gown tailored perfectly, her hair pinned with pearls. "She asked for you," Lisa said. "Upstairs. She wants to talk." James nodded and followed without a word. Emily's suite was like a cathedral of light. Massive windows bathed the room in gold, illuminating the white of her dress were hung by the window. Makeup artists and bridesmaids gave them space as he walked in. Emily sat at the vanity, her eyes catching his in the mirror. She dismissed the others with a glance. "Give us a minute?" When the room emptied, she turned to face him, resting her hands in her lap. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead. Are you happy for me?" The question struck him harder than he expected. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the window, resting a hand against the frame. "I'm happy you found someone you think you can build a life with," he said finally. "But that doesn't mean I trust everything about this." Emily's eyes narrowed. "You think Charles is bad for me?" James turned. "I think Charles is the kind of man who believes everyone has a price. And I think you're not used to being treated like an asset instead of a person." She stood, crossing her arms. "That's not fair." "No," he said. "It's not. None of this is fair." Not the way I lost time with you. Not the way your mother remarried, and suddenly my voice didn't matter. Not the way I watched you drift into a world I was never allowed to be part of. That was never my intention. He softened slightly. I know, but intentions don't change outcomes. There was a long silence between them. The kind of silence that builds on years, not minutes. I used to wait by the phone on your birthdays, he said quietly. Not because I expected a call. I just wanted to believe there was still a thread between us, something invisible and strong. But I realized over time, I was holding it alone. Emily sat back down, blinking quickly. I never meant to let go. James stepped forward. Then don't. Not now. She met his gaze, and for a moment, she looked like the little girl who used to fall asleep in his truck after long days at the fairgrounds, who used to hand him tools in the garage and say, "I'm your assistant forever, Daddy." But those days were gone. I just want a day to go well, she said finally. James nodded. Then be sure you know what you're walking into. He left before he said too much, before the weight of what he'd heard the day before came spilling out and ruined her chance to see things for herself. She needed clarity, not panic. Downstairs, the guests were arriving. Men in tailored suits, women in gowns that cost more than James's truck. He watched from a corner near the grand staircase, his eyes scanning the crowd. That's when he saw the man from the garden, Charles's associate. He was speaking to someone James didn't recognize, a stocky man in a gray suit, carrying a thin leather briefcase. They exchanged something, papers, possibly, before disappearing down a hallway closed to guests. James didn't follow. Not yet. He needed something more. Instead, he made his way to the back of the estate, where deliveries and staff came and went without fanfare. There, near a row of catering vans, he found Julia. You said you'd ask around, he said. She glanced around, nodded. I have something. Not a full copy, but I snapped a photo of the prenup summary on someone's clipboard this morning. You want to see this? She pulled out her phone and showed him. The text was sharp, legal, but clear. Clauses about inheritance transfers, stipulations tied to marriage length, control over voting shares in two separate companies, both of which Emily now held minority stakes in through her late grandfather's trust. James scrolled silently, jaw clenched. They're using her, he said. This isn't a marriage. It's a strategy. I figured as much, Julia said. You gonna stop it? Not yet, he muttered. But they won't see it coming. She hesitated. You sure you're up for this? These people. They bleed like anyone else, he said. They just believe they don't. He returned inside as the music swelled. Ushers were guiding guests to their seats in the garden. The altar had been constructed beneath a canopy of white flowers, with golden chairs lined in neat rows, and a string quartet beginning to play Vivaldi. James walked alone to his place near the front, a seat labeled discreetly for the father of the bride. As he sat, his thoughts drifted, not to Emily, not to Charles, but to the moment he'd signed the divorce papers over a decade ago. Lisa hadn't fought him for custody. She hadn't needed to. The court knew where power lived. He was given weekends, holidays, and slowly, even those slipped away. When Emily moved east for college, that was the end of it. He didn't blame her. Not entirely. The world had pulled her in like a tide, and he hadn't had the strength then to hold on. But now, as the guests settled and the music shifted, he looked toward the house, waiting for the bride to appear. He wouldn't let her drift again, not without knowing the truth, not without knowing that behind the curtain of perfection, behind applause and champagne, her future was being mortgaged, and he would not be silent much longer. The ceremony began beneath an open sky streaked with pale gold. Autumn leaves stirred lightly on the breeze as the guests turned to watch the procession unfold. Emily emerged at the top of the garden path, framed by the archway of roses, her arm looped through Charles's. That was unexpected. James had been told he would walk her down the aisle. But here she was, gliding past him without a glance, led not by her father, but by the man she was about to marry. The slight was surgical. James didn't rise. He remained seated, his eyes fixed on her, watching for signs, hesitation, discomfort, anything to betray a crack in the perfect image being projected. But she moved like she was floating, her expression serene. It wasn't until she reached the altar that she glanced in his direction. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something flickered. Guilt, uncertainty. But it passed quickly. The officiant began to speak, his voice calm and rehearsed. James barely heard him. His attention was on the briefcase carried earlier by Charles's associate. The man now seated near the back, close enough to flee unnoticed, if needed. James noted it, cataloged it. He had grown used to reading people quickly in his line of work. You had to, when your income depended on who was lying about what under the hood. As the vows were exchanged, James rose and stepped quietly away from the seated crowd. No one stopped him. Most eyes were on the couple, cameras snapping in quiet bursts. He circled the edge of the garden, moving through the shadows of the arbor and toward the back of the estate. He knew what he was looking for, and he knew exactly where to find it. The staff hallway was deserted, the corridor cool and dim beneath the stone archways. He passed doors labeled with room numbers, guest storage, and finally, private office. The lock was electronic, but the door was slightly ajar. That was a mistake. James pushed it open. Inside, the room smelled of leather and old books. A massive desk dominated the space, with marble inkwell and several folders laid out neatly in the center. He closed the door behind him and scanned quickly. Drawers locked. No time to force them. But the desk surface held something that didn't belong. A thick document in a branded folder labeled Mendoza and Crane, Private Holdings. He opened it. Inside was a prenup. Not a summary. Not a mention. The full document. Dozens of pages of fine print, stamped, initialed, and recently dated. It was worse than he'd imagined. Clause after clause locked Emily into terms that were buried in complex legalese. Not only did Charles gain advisory control over her inherited shares upon marriage, but there were stipulations for her behavior, public representation, and decision-making regarding any future business ventures. Violating those terms would shift her ownership rights to a holding company Charles controlled indirectly. The document disguised it with phrases like fiduciary partnership and legacy preservation, but the meaning was clear. It was theft disguised as legality. At the back was a final clause, handwritten in blue ink bearing both their signatures. It granted temporary full power of attorney to Charles for a period of 90 days after the marriage. The signature beside Emily's name was shaky, uneven, rushed. James stared at it. He didn't know when she had signed it, but something told him she hadn't read every page. Maybe she trusted him. Maybe she was pressured. Either way, she had just handed away control of her future. All of it. He heard footsteps. He snapped the folder shut and slid it into his tuxedo jacket. Just as the door opened, Charles stood there, expression unreadable. "Trespassing," he said calmly. "I'd expect that from a man who never quite understood boundaries." James didn't answer. Charles stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "You're not as invisible as you think. Julia, fired. That little assistant thought she could outmaneuver me. You? Well, I'll let you stay for now, but this is your last act." James stepped forward, voice low. "You made her sign something she didn't understand." "She knew enough," Charles replied. "She wanted security. I offered it." "What did you offer her, James?" "A rusty garage and memories of a life she outgrew." James stared him down. "She's not a tool." Charles's smile thinned. "She's a gateway, a pretty, educated, media-savvy heir to a trust most people forgot existed. And now she's mine. Legally, contractually, irrevocably." James looked him over, taking in the perfectly tailored suit, the smugness barely masked beneath corporate civility. "You always talk like a man who's never been punched." Charles laughed. "And you always talk like a man who wants to matter, but doesn't." James stepped back. Enjoy the reception. He left the office, the folder heavy beneath his jacket. Back outside, the ceremony had ended. The guests were clapping as Emily and Charles walked down the aisle. Photographers circled. Confetti floated in the air. It was picture perfect. But James didn't look at Emily. Not yet. He went straight to his truck. He kept a contact list in the glove box, old names from old days, friends who owed favors. One of them, Grant Delaney, worked in corporate investigations now. He had tried for years to expose the shell companies and political donations, masking deeper fraud in families like the Hawthorns. James had ignored him until now. He dialed. "Grant," he said, "you still hungry for blood?" There was a pause, then laughter. "James Walker, never thought I'd hear from you again. I've got something. Real. A contract. Multiple breaches of fiduciary ethics. Maybe tax issues too. Hawthorne's hiding a game behind a marriage. Send me everything." "I will," James said, "but I need one favor first. If I'm going to blow this up, I want it to land loud." "I can make that happen." Back at the estate, the reception was already underway. Champagne flowed. Speeches were queued. The press had been invited. Everything was staged for the public unveiling of the perfect union. But James stood just outside, watching. He had the truth in his jacket. And the right time to use it was coming soon. Very soon. The reception unfolded like a scene from a royal gala. White roses spilled across the long dining tables, each place setting adorned with hand-calligraphed cards, gold-rimmed china, and vintage glassware that sparkled under the soft canopy lights. A live jazz quartet filled the garden with easy elegance as guests laughed, mingled, and toasted to the newlyweds. No expense had been spared. Every detail was calculated to impress. James stood near the back, drink untouched in his hand, scanning the crowd. He wasn't watching for familiar faces. He had stopped looking for those years ago. He was searching for Charles. He found him easily, surrounded by a semicircle of guests near the champagne fountain. A practiced smile on his face and his arm loosely around Emily's waist. From a distance, it looked like affection, but James had seen enough to know the truth. That arm was ownership. Emily, to her credit, looked radiant, but distracted. James watched her eyes as they flitted between conversations, landing nowhere for long. The weight of the day, of the performance, seemed to settle on her shoulders now that the ceremony was over. James turned his attention to his phone, discreetly checking his messages. One from Grant had come in 10 minutes earlier. "It's all real. These holding companies tie to offshore accounts Hawthorne never declared. Shell firms. Illegal transfer of assets if leveraged post-marriage. I'm pulling documents now. You just started a fire." He stared at the message for a long moment, then slid the phone back into his jacket. Time to get closer. He approached the main reception tent, easing his way through the crowd. Most guests barely noticed him. The ones who did offered nods of vague recognition, the kind reserved for distant relatives or lower-tier dignitaries. He moved past the bar, past the dance floor where a few couples swayed politely, and stopped just short of the head table. Charles saw him. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. James raised his glass slightly, offering a silent, mocking toast, and turned toward the open bar. He ordered nothing, just stood with the illusion of purpose, and waited. Minutes passed. Then he felt the shift. Charles slipped away from the crowd and approached him, casual but precise. "You're still here," Charles said, voice low, almost friendly. James didn't look at him. "It's my daughter's wedding." "Is it?" Charles asked, folding his hands in front of him. "Because from what I can tell, you've done more brooding than celebrating." "I was busy reading the fine print," James replied. Charles's smile twitched. "I'd be careful if I were you." James turned to face him fully. "You already crossed the line when you forged that clause. She didn't know what she was signing, did she?" Charles didn't blink. What she knew or didn't know is irrelevant. She signed. That's all that matters. "Not the people I've sent it to," James said. "The same people who've been trying to prove you've been laundering trust assets for years." Charles stiffened, just slightly. "You really think this will play well in the media?" James continued. "The charming billionaire who duped his wife into handing over her inheritance so he could bail out a sinking empire?" Charles leaned in, lowering his voice. "You don't have the reach to make that stick." "I don't need reach," James said. "I need truth, and the truth's been dying to speak." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Charles exhaled, quietly, a sharp breath through his nose. "You want to blow up your daughter's wedding for a headline?" he asked. James shook his head. "I want to save her from becoming a pawn in your next bailout." This isn't about ego. It's about integrity. Something you wouldn't recognize if it signed your paychecks. Charles took a step back, adjusting his cufflinks. You always had a martyr complex. And you always had a God complex, James replied. Difference is, mine made me a father. Yours made you a parasite. Charles didn't respond. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd with mechanical poise. James followed him with his eyes, then scanned the perimeter. Cameras were here. Journalists, maybe not the investigative kind, but enough to spread a spark if it was lit properly. He stepped away from the bar, cutting across the floor toward the band, where the microphone sat idle on its stand. The coordinator, already half-panicked, intercepted him. "Sir," the toast lineup. James waved her off. "There's been a change." He stepped up to the mic. The quartet fell silent. Conversations tapered. Heads turned. James stood in the center of the reception, eyes on the crowd, voice steady. "I wasn't scheduled to speak tonight," he began, "but I think I'd regret it if I didn't." Emily turned sharply in her seat, confusion on her face. "I want to thank everyone here for being part of what's supposed to be a celebration of love, of new beginnings. But sometimes we get so wrapped up in appearances that we forget to look beneath them." He paused. "I wasn't born into this world. I built mine from the ground up. Every dollar I made came with calloused hands. Every lesson I learned was paid for in time, in failure, in hard-won truth. So I've always valued honesty. Not the kind that gets printed on brochures or spoken from podiums, but the kind that shows up when it matters." He let his eyes land on Charles. "And honesty matters most when someone you love is being lied to." The crowd stirred. James continued. "There's a document, a contract, hidden in the middle of a wedding. A document that turns the celebration into a transaction, that redefines love as leverage." Whispers swept through the guests like a wave. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I'm here to warn someone I love that what she signed isn't protection. It's entrapment." Emily stood slowly, the color draining from her face. Charles was already in motion, heading toward the mic. James turned to her. "I'm sorry, Emily. I should have told you sooner. But I wanted you to see it for yourself. And now you can." He reached into his jacket and held up the folder. "This is the contract you signed. And this," he looked at the crowd, "is the man who wrote it." The silence was unbearable. Then, slowly, phones began to rise, and the world started watching. The room didn't explode. Not yet. The silence that followed James's speech was worse than a riot. It was a kind of silence that precedes a storm, tense, calculated, filled with a dozen half-decisions sparking in 100 minds. Guests shifted in their seats, some exchanging glances, others frozen in place. The reception's elegance now hung like a curtain torn open, revealing something raw and undeniable. Emily stood motionless near the head table, one hand resting on the chair beside her, the other curled against her waist. Her eyes were locked on the folder in her father's hand. Her wedding dress, tailored perfection, radiant under the canopy lights, suddenly looked like it belonged to someone else. Charles reached the microphone before anyone else could. He didn't touch James, didn't confront him. Instead, he stood beside him, posture composed, voice smooth. "Let's all take a breath," Charles said. "There's no need for drama. Whatever concerns James believe he has, we can address them in private. This is a celebration, not a courtroom." A few polite nods came from the guests, but most remained still. James didn't move. He looked at Emily, then turned and stepped down from the platform, leaving the microphone behind. Charles took his place fully, smiling as if nothing had been interrupted. "Let's raise a glass," he said, "to love, to patience, and to clarity, because in every partnership, communication is key." The toast fell flat. Still, Charles powered through, and the jazz band picked up again as if nothing had happened. Waiters resumed their circulation, passing out champagne with slightly more urgency. But beneath the performance, a new current had entered the room. Whispers, glances, suspicion. James made his way to the side of the tent, phone in hand. He found a quiet corner near the catering exit and dialed Grant. "It started," James said. "I'm already seeing it. Grant replied. Clips are surfacing online. People filmed it. I've got 3 outlets pinging me for comment. The contract's legit. If we release the details now, this whole wedding becomes an exhibit. Not yet, James said. Let it breathe. I want them to start talking before we confirm anything. Smart, Grant said. But don't wait too long. If they smell a counter-narrative coming, they'll try to bury it. James hung up and looked back at the reception. Emily had disappeared from her seat. Lisa was speaking quietly with a group of older guests, her face a mass of polite confusion. Charles had returned to mingling, though his movements were tighter now, his smile brittle. James slipped through the side of the tent and circled toward the service entrance. Julia was there, arms crossed, phone pressed to her ear. She saw him and nodded. I got word from one of the catering staff. She said quietly. Charles made a call during dinner, told someone to clean up the office. Probably means removing anything that links back to the prenup scheme. James tightened his jaw. We've got copies. Let him clean. The originals are already digital. She glanced at her phone, and the internet's starting to murmur. Some finance bloggers are picking up on the shell company names from the clause you flagged. James smiled grimly. That's the first crack. Inside, the reception began to fracture. Small groups peeled away from the main tables, forming circles of speculation. One of the bridesmaids was visibly upset. A groomsman whispered something to Charles that made him clench his jaw. The illusion of control was still intact, but just barely. James moved back through the garden and found Emily standing near the rose trellis, alone. She didn't turn when he approached. Her voice was flat when she spoke. You could have warned me. I tried, he said. Not like this. James paused. I found the folder in a locked office. You signed a document that gives Charles control of your inheritance, your shares, even decision-making authority over your trust. Tell me you read every page. She said nothing. I know how convincing he is, James added. How clean it all looks. But he doesn't see you. He sees a gate, a strategy. And you're not a strategy. You're my daughter. She turned then. Her eyes were glassy but dry. I thought I was protecting myself, she said quietly. He said it was a formality, that it would help keep things organized while we transitioned after the wedding. Did you ask why he needed power of attorney? He said it was temporary, that it would make legal filings easier. James exhaled through his nose. Temporary can still do permanent damage. Emily shook her head. This is too much. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. It still can be, James said, but not if you keep pretending you're safe when you're not. She nodded slowly, processing it. Then her gaze drifted past him toward the tent. He's going to hate me for this. No, James said. He's going to hate losing. That's not the same. She gave a short, bitter laugh. They walked back together, slowly. By the time they reached the tent, the reception had cooled. The energy wasn't celebratory anymore. It was suspicious. One of the Hawthorne cousins was arguing with an older man in a corner. A woman from the press was asking pointed questions. Charles was still holding court, but it looked more like damage control now. James made one more move. He pulled out his phone, opened his photo gallery, and uploaded the images of the prenup and power of attorney to a secure drive. He drafted a message to Grant with one sentence. Go loud. He hit send. Less than 5 minutes later, the alert started. Phones buzzed across the tent. People turned away from their conversations to look at their screens. Headlines flashed across news feeds. One of the caterers gasped audibly. James saw Charles freeze mid-sentence, and the collapse began, not with an explosion, but with eyes widening, with guests turning away, with reputation unraveling in silence. By the time Charles stepped up to give his official wedding toast, the atmosphere inside the reception tent had changed entirely. It was no longer warm and festive. The air was tense, like a wire stretched too tight. Conversations had slowed to murmurs. Eyes tracked every movement with careful attention. A storm had passed through the party. It was invisible but unmistakable. Charles cleared his throat and raised a champagne flute, wearing a smile that had grown more forced with each passing minute. Even his posture had shifted. He stood slightly straighter, tighter, as though holding himself together by sheer control. Behind him, Emily sat at the head table, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. "I'd like to thank everyone here for joining us today," Charles began. "It's an incredible privilege to celebrate this new chapter with the people we care about most. Family, friends, mentors." His voice rang clearly through the speakers, but the rhythm was off. The guests heard it too. There was hesitation between each phrase, a slight tremble in the pauses. Charles scanned the room, and what he saw did not comfort him. People weren't smiling. They were watching. "I met Emily during the conference," he continued, trying to regain ground. "And from the moment we spoke, I knew there was something extraordinary about her. Not just her intelligence or her compassion, but her strength, the way she carries herself, the way she inspires people around her." James remained near the back of the tent, arms crossed, listening. He hadn't taken a seat. He wanted Charles to see him standing. "We come from different worlds," Charles said with a carefully measured chuckle. "Her father reminded me of that earlier today." A few polite, nervous laughs followed, but they fizzled quickly. "And that's okay," he added. "Difference doesn't divide us. It strengthens us. My background is in business, strategy, organization. I tend to see life as a series of structured choices, of opportunities and risks." He lifted his glass slightly. "And marrying Emily was the best investment of my life." A heavy silence settled over the room. James saw it land, hard and wrong. The choice of word, the tone, the implication. The metaphor that should never have left his lips. Emily's expression didn't change, but she leaned back ever so slightly in her chair, as if distancing herself not from Charles, but from the version of her life that had just been described aloud. Charles noticed it. He tried to recover. "I mean, of course, I don't mean that literally. I mean that love is always a leap, and this one has given me more confidence than any boardroom ever could." But it was too late. The crowd wasn't following anymore. Several guests were no longer paying attention to the toast at all. They were reading their phones, sharing links, whispering behind napkins. A well-dressed woman near the middle table turned to her husband and muttered something sharp under her breath. One of the groomsmen slid out of the tent. Phone pressed his ear. Charles forged ahead, visibly flustered now. "Anyway, I just want to say that I look forward to building a future together. A partnership. One where we support each other in every challenge and every victory." To Emily, he raised his glass again, but this time, fewer people followed. James saw it. The cracks. The unraveling. He had expected resistance, maybe even a confrontation. But what he got was something far more devastating for a man like Charles. Loss of control. Loss of narrative. He didn't need to shout the truth anymore. It was already leaking into the room. He stepped toward the edge of the tent where the speakers were connected and found the event manager nearby. She was on the phone, her expression tight. "Excuse me," James said, drawing her attention. "Yes, I need the mic." She hesitated. "We're not. Now." Something in his tone cut through the formalities. She handed it over. He stepped to the center of the tent, the crowd still murmuring from the toast's awkward ending. When the sound of the microphone adjusting echoed across the speakers, people turned again. James didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I won't take long," he said. "But I want to speak about something my daughter didn't ask for. Something no one asked for. Truth that interrupts comfort." He glanced toward Emily, who was sitting up right now, her eyes locked on his. "This week, I came here expecting to be tolerated. I expected to be out of place. And I was, but I also paid attention. I saw deals being made behind closed doors. I saw contracts built on coercion, not care. I saw love used as leverage." Gasps moved to the tent like a slow wind. And while some of you might believe these things happen quietly, behind boardroom walls, inside inheritance clauses, I believe in saying them aloud, because silence is how people like Charles win. It's how they keep people small. Charles stepped forward. "James, this isn't your moment." James turned slightly. It was never meant to be, but sometimes the moment finds you anyway. He looked at the crowd again. "I built my life fixing things. Cars, engines, Bent frames. I learned that if something's crooked, you don't paint over it. You break it open, realign it, and start over. That's how you make it strong again. He paused, then turned back to Emily. And if you want to start over, I'll be here. Not to fix it, but to help you hold the wrench. He set the mic down on the table. No applause followed, just stillness, and then a slow, subtle shift in the way everyone looked at Charles. Because now they weren't just suspicious. They were certain. Charles left the stage with the stiffness of a man who had spent years mastering control and, in the span of minutes, had lost all grip on the reins. He didn't acknowledge James again. He didn't address the crowd. Instead, he moved straight to the tent, past the guests, straight-backed and tight-jawed, as if retreating to a war room. But the war had already begun, and not in private. It started with a single phone vibrating loudly on a table near the center. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the ambient murmuring gave way to soft gasps and confused whispers as guests began to check their phones. Notifications lit up screens in waves. Finance blogs, business news alerts, anonymous leaks, headlines that had no place at a wedding reception. Hawthorne Holdings linked to fraudulent trust transfers through marital proxy deal. Power of attorney clause hidden in Hawthorne prenup raises legal red flags. Exclusive. Anonymous source leaks documents suggesting Emily Walker's inheritance targeted in secret deal. James stood near the edge of the tent, watching unfold. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The information was doing exactly what he'd hoped it would, spreading without anyone needing to say a word. The whispers were no longer about speculation. They were confirmation. Charles's mother was the first to speak loudly enough to be overheard. "What is this nonsense?" she said to the tall man beside her, holding up her phone. "This blog says Charles manipulated the marriage to gain financial control of the Walker Trust. Is this some kind of joke?" The man didn't answer. He was reading the same article. Emily remained seated at the head table, the only one not holding a device. Her hands were in her lap, her face pale. She was surrounded by the sound of her world recalculating. Lisa approached her daughter from behind, leaning down to whisper, "Do you know anything about this?" Emily didn't respond. Lisa crouched lower, her voice firmer. "Emily, did you sign something without a lawyer?" Still no answer. Just that same fixed gaze across the tent where Charles had disappeared. James didn't approach her. Not yet. She had to process this without him hovering. Instead, he stepped away from the tent entirely, letting the crowd digest the revelation without his presence adding to the noise. Outside, under the late afternoon sky, the distant hum of traffic and birdsong sounded almost surreal compared to the chaos building inside. He checked his phone again. Grant had sent another message. It's gone national, leaked to 2 major outlets. Legal analysts are already dissecting the power of attorney clause. You just became the trigger for the biggest corporate ethics scandal of the year. James allowed himself one quiet breath. Then the door beside the tent slammed open, and Charles came striding across the gravel path. Phone to his ear, voice sharp. "I don't care how you spin it," he said, pacing. "Shut it down. No, now. Reach out to Bartlett. He owes us a favor. And get Kramer to publish a statement in the Herald. Damage control, anything." He turned, stopped short when he saw James standing a few feet away. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Charles ended his call and lowered the phone. "You think you've done something heroic here?" he asked. "You've embarrassed your daughter, sabotaged your wedding, publicly humiliated your family." James kept his voice calm. "No, you did that. I just made sure no one missed it." Charles stepped closer. She signed the contract. It was legal. Legal doesn't mean ethical. It doesn't mean right. She's an adult. She made her choices. "No," James said. "She trusted the wrong man. That's not a choice. That's a mistake. One I'll help her recover from." Charles sneered. "You're a mechanic, a ghost from a past she outgrew. Don't pretend this has anything to do with love. You couldn't stand that she chose a better life than you could ever give her." James met his gaze without blinking. "You keep calling it a better life, but all I see is a prison with marble floors." Charles opened his mouth, then closed it. The fight he had expected. Loud, messy, emotional, wasn't coming. James wouldn't give it to him. Inside the tent, the murmuring had grown louder. A few guests had left. Others were still reading, searching, trying to piece together what they were witnessing. Then, through the open side flap, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "I need to speak." It was Emily. She stood behind the microphone at the center of the tent, holding nothing. Her veil had been removed. Her hair was slightly undone, but her voice was clear. Everyone turned. James didn't move, not yet, but he stepped closer. Emily took a breath. "I know there's been a lot of confusion," she began, "and I wish I could tell you I was shocked by what you're seeing. But the truth is, I signed that document." Gasps rippled. "I signed it because I was told it was standard. I was told it would protect me, that it was just a precaution. I didn't question it, because I want to believe the man I loved wouldn't use it against me." Her voice caught for just a second. Then she steadied. "But what I've learned today is that love and business don't mix, that you can be used without even realizing it, and that trust, once broken, cannot be patched with silence or denial." She looked directly into the crowd. "I want to thank my father for saying what I didn't have the strength to say myself, for making sure the truth wasn't buried under flowers and champagne." The room remained frozen. "I don't know what comes next," she said, "but I know what won't. I won't be part of a lie. I won't sign away my voice again. And I won't pretend this marriage is built on anything but manipulation." She turned, left the microphone behind, and walked out of the tent. No one followed. Not Charles. Not Lisa. Only James, a few moments later, stepping into the quiet aftershock of her honesty. Not to comfort her, not to take credit, just to stand nearby, quietly, as the secret stopped slipping out and began being spoken out loud. The altar still stood in the garden behind the tent, untouched since the ceremony had concluded. White petals clung to the floorboards, caught in the folds of satin ribbons that fluttered faintly in the wind. It had been the centerpiece of a meticulously planned performance, but now it stood as a monument to everything that had unraveled. No one lingered near it. Guests who hadn't already left were drifting toward the parking areas in clumps, muttering apologies to no one in particular, faces tight with discomfort. Emily remained out of sight. James waited near the perimeter of the property, watching as staff members began breaking down the decorations. The collapse had reached a point of no return. There were no salvaging smiles left, no more scheduled speeches. The event that had been planned to signal prestige and legacy was now a live case study in downfall. Inside the estate, Charles was on damage control. He had locked himself in one of the side rooms with 2 members of the Hawthorne board and a crisis PR consultant who had arrived less than 30 minutes after the story went public. James had seen her exit a sleek black car, phone already pressed to her ear, face unreadable. She hadn't smiled once. Lisa had returned to bridal suite, frantically calling relatives to clarify what was happening, but it was clear to everyone that the wedding had failed not because of the moment, but because of everything that had built up to it. The veneer had been cracked open. The marriage, however legally completed, was dead before it even left the altar. It was nearing dusk when James finally saw Emily again. She stepped out of a side entrance, no longer in her wedding dress. She wore dark jeans and a simple white blouse, her makeup washed off, her expression warm but calm. She walked toward the garden, toward the altar that had once marked the beginning of her new life, and now represented its undoing. James followed her at a distance. He gave her space, the same way he always had when she was younger and needed to think, after she lost her first high school debate, after her dog died, after her mother moved out. Emily didn't cry easily. Her silences were how she rebuilt herself. She stopped at the steps leading up to the altar, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. James approached slowly, until he was close enough that she didn't have to look for him, just feel that he was there. "I thought I knew what I was doing," she said quietly, not turning around. "I really did. I thought I was being smart, strategic, grown up." James didn't interrupt. "I thought if I kept everything polished, my voice, my resume, my relationship, then maybe people would stop thinking of me as just someone's daughter. Maybe I'd finally belong in those rooms, at those tables." James stepped up beside her, looking at the same altar. "And did you?" No, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I was just another pawn, just one in a better dress. The silence stretched. Then she turned to face him. I'm sorry I shut you out. James met her eyes. I never needed you to be perfect. I just needed you to be safe. She nodded slowly. I'm not sure I ever was. He let that sit. Then, what do you want to do now? I don't know, she admitted. I can't go back into that house. I can't pretend any of this didn't happen. Then don't, James said simply. We'll go. Her eyes widened slightly. I've got a tank full of gas, a clean place to sleep, and an extra key. You don't have to decide anything tonight. Just come home. Home. It had been years since that word meant anything concrete between them. But now, in the fading light, it felt real again. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped up onto the altar, where she had once stood waiting for vows that now meant nothing. She looked down at the floor, at the aisle she had walked, at the chairs still scattered in the grass. I should have asked more questions, she said. About the documents, about the timing, about why he was so insistent. Abusers always want to rush, James said. Deals, weddings, apologies. They don't want time, because time reveals them. She looked at him sharply, not in anger, but with something like respect. You knew, before all of this. I suspected, James replied, but I wanted you to see it yourself. If I had pushed too early, you might have fought me instead of him. Emily stepped down and faced him directly. You didn't just protect me. You exposed him, in front of everyone. I didn't do it to embarrass you. I know, she said. You did it because no one else would. They walked together away from the altar, the path now quiet, the estate behind them beginning to dim. Staff were packing up food, breaking down the dance floor, folding linens. Some avoided looking at Emily entirely. Others gave her brief, sympathetic glances. Near the parking lot, Lisa stood beside her car, phone still in hand, eyes flashing as she argued with someone. Another relative, perhaps, or a reporter. She saw Emily and took a step forward. Sweetheart, she began. Emily held up a hand. Not now. Lisa blinked, stunned. I'll talk to you later, Emily added, quieter. I need space. Lisa watched her for a moment, then nodded stiffly and turned away. At James's truck, Emily paused before getting in. You know he's going to spin it, right? That he'll have lawyers. That he'll sue. Let him, James said, unlocking the door. He can throw whatever he wants. It doesn't change what's true. They drove off without fanfare, the estate shrinking in the rear-view mirror. No applause, no rice tossed into the air. Just headlights on an empty road, and the sough of an old engine carrying them back towards something real. The wedding had ended. The contract had failed. The empire had cracked. And for the first time in years, father and daughter left not as guests of someone else's world, but as survivors of their own. The drive back to Ohio was long, quiet, and filled with a tension that didn't need words to exist. Emily sat in the passenger seat of her father's truck, staring out at the blur of road and trees, still wearing the remnants of the day. Her hair half done, a necklace clasped askew at her collarbone, and her skin pale from hours under public scrutiny. James drove with both hands on the wheel, not pressing for conversation. The air between them was steady, unspoken but solid, like a rope that had been cut and knotted again, rough, imperfect, but stronger for the strain. By the time they pulled into the gravel driveway behind James's house, the sun was dipping behind the tree line. The house was small and modest, with weathered siding and a porch swing that creaked in the breeze. Emily stepped out slowly, looking around as if seeing the place for the first time, not with judgment, but with quiet curiosity. James unlocked the door and flicked on the lights. The living room smelled like old wood and motor oil, the latter coming from a pair of boots near the back door and a toolbox that never seemed to leave the corner of the kitchen. You can take the bedroom, he said simply. I'll crash on the couch. Emily nodded, setting down the overnight bag James had grabbed from the estate before they left. For a long moment, neither said anything. Then Emily turned to him. What happens now? James rubbed his hands together, thinking. Now we let the truth finish what it started. The next morning, they woke early. James made coffee the way he always had, strong enough to stand a spoon in. Emily sipped it with a grimace, but didn't complain. She spent most of the day on the phone, talking to legal advisors, to friends she thought she trusted, to one of her late grandfather's old business partners who had always treated her like an equal. James stayed in the background, making calls of his own. Grant had confirmed that several major outlets were preparing follow-up stories. The evidence had held under legal scrutiny. The prenup and power of attorney, along with the chain of holding companies connected to Charles, had exposed more than a simple manipulation. It hinted at a larger, orchestrated scheme involving family trusts, offshore accounts, and silent board takeovers that could affect multiple businesses tied to the Hawthorne family legacy. Charles hadn't made a public statement yet, but silence in moments like this was its own kind of confession. That night, James sat on the porch, beer in hand, watching the stars come out. Emily joined him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "I've been thinking about giving a statement," she said. James looked at her sideways. "You sure you want to jump back into the fire?" "I'm not jumping back in," she said. "I'm setting the record straight. On my terms." She paused. "He used my name, my face. He wanted my inheritance, but he also wanted my image, the trust people had in me. That's what let him get so close. If I stay silent now, I give him that for free." James nodded. "Then you do it your way." The following morning, Emily recorded a video. Nothing flashy, just her, sitting on the same porch swing where she used to eat popsicles every summer as a child. No makeup, no edits, no filters. She spoke clearly. "I was manipulated," she said. "I was presented with legal documents that were framed as protective but were designed to transfer control of my assets and decisions to someone else. I didn't catch it at first, but now I see it clearly. I've dissolved all legal ties initiated under false pretenses, and I'm cooperating with authorities investigating the broader implications of the scheme." She ended it simply. "I won't let silence be mistaken for shame. I'm not ashamed. I'm awake." They uploaded it together. Within hours, it spread like fire. The media spun quickly. Headlines changed. Commentators began referring to Charles as a disgraced heir. One legal expert called the situation a textbook case of estate coercion masked by romance. Social media rallied behind Emily, sharing her video with praise, empathy, and outrage. Then came the final blow. James received a call from Grant. "You're going to want to see this," Grant said. Federal prosecutors just confirmed an investigation into Hawthorne Holding for tax fraud, coercive business practices, and misrepresentation of corporate interests. James didn't react immediately. He sat back in his chair, eyes closed for a second. "Also," Grant added, "they've subpoenaed every document tied to the wedding. That includes the venue, the vendors, even the wedding planner. Apparently, Charles used the event to host 2 investors who were promised post-marriage control of Emily's inheritance shares." James opened his eyes. "That's the nail." "The whole thing's crumbling," Grant confirmed. "And you started it." James didn't smile. He just nodded. That evening, a camera crew waited outside Charles's Manhattan office building. He didn't exit through the front. He was seen hours later slipping out through a side door, sunglasses on, escorted by 2 assistants. Reporters shouted questions. He said nothing. Emily watched the clip once, then shut her laptop. James didn't ask how she felt. She didn't need to say it. The next morning, the front porch was quieter. Autumn had deepened overnight, crisping the air. Emily stood at the edge of the yard, phone in hand, pacing slowly. When she returned to the steps, she looked at James with a determined calm. "I've decided not to hide," she said, "but I'm not going back to my old life either. I want to build something different, something clean." He nodded, "Then start fresh." She smiled faintly. "With your help." He stood, reached for his keys. "Where we going?" "To see a lawyer," she said. "I want to transfer the remainder of my trust to a new foundation, and I want you on the board." James blinked. "Me?" She nodded. "If you hadn't fought for me, I'd still be married to a lie. You were the only one who didn't try to use me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for his jacket. "Let's go make it official." They drove off down the old gravel road, not away from a scandal, not toward revenge, but into the slow, deliberate beginning of something real. And for the first time in years, James Walker felt something settle deep in his chest. Not pride, not victory, peace. In the weeks that followed the wedding's collapse, the story refused to leave the headlines. What began as whispers around a ruined reception had turned into a national spectacle. News anchors dissected every piece of leaked documentation. Financial analysts traced a tangled web of companies tied to Charles's name, uncovering not just ethical violations, but criminal exposure. Commentators labeled the incident everything from the fall of a dynasty to the most elegant scam of the decade. But for James and Emily, the noise faded quickly once they returned home. They had no use for headlines. Their days began early. James worked in the garage again, this time with Emily often nearby. Sometimes holding a wrench, other times just sitting on an overturned bucket, laptop open, researching nonprofit bylaws or filing legal paperwork. Their new routine wasn't planned. It just happened, quietly and without fanfare, like most meaningful recoveries. Emily didn't speak much in the first few days after the public storm hit its peak, but her presence was steady. There was something grounding about the clink of metal in her father's garage, the hiss of air compressors, the faint scent of grease and old pine. Here, she wasn't a headline. She wasn't a scandal. She was just herself. One morning, she brought out a stack of papers and dropped them on the workbench beside James's coffee mug. "I incorporated the foundation yesterday," she said. James wiped his hands on a rag and leaned over the stack. "What's it called?" "Walker House," she replied. "I thought about naming it after Grandpa, but then I thought, maybe it's time we build something with our name. Not just mine. Yours too." He looked at her, surprised. "What's it going to do?" "Scholarships," she said. "For kids who come from small towns and don't have family legacies or private tutors or country clubs. The ones who get dismissed before they even open their mouths. We'll help them get to college, or learn trades, or just find solid ground." He nodded. "That's a damn good idea." She smiled. "I figured if I can't change where I came from, maybe I can help someone else go somewhere better." They filed the documents that afternoon. James insisted on using the old printer in the shop, despite its squeaky tray and faded toner. Emily didn't complain. She sat beside him on the floor with a legal pad, scribbling out plans while James argued with the machine. Later that evening, as the sun began to fall behind the tree line, they sat on the porch watching the sky dim into shades of violet. "I thought I'd feel angrier," Emily said. "Why don't you?" James asked. "Because I don't regret walking away," she said, "even with all the damage. I think if I'd stayed, that would have been the real loss." He nodded. "You didn't run. That's what matters." She looked at him. "I want to go back to the city eventually. But when I do, I want to be on my terms. Not with someone else's name or someone else's money telling me who to be." "Then stay here as long as you need." The days grew colder as autumn edged toward winter. Emily took over the guest room permanently and began painting the walls a soft green. She reorganized the bookshelves in the hallway and added a small desk near the kitchen window. When she wasn't working on the foundation, she helped James in the shop, often crawling under cars with a flashlight and a stubborn resolve that reminded James of her as a child. News of the federal investigation deepened. Charles was subpoenaed twice and forced to appear for questioning. His legal team issued a generic statement, claiming the documents were mutually agreed upon and that the nature of the marriage's dissolution remains a private matter. But the damage was irreversible. Several companies quietly cut ties. 2 board seats were suspended pending review. By the time December came, Hawthorne Holdings' value had plummeted by nearly 40%. James read the headlines in passing, never lingering. He had no desire to gloat. Watching the empire fall wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about closure. And the most dignified form of closure was rebuilding what mattered. One afternoon, Emily returned from a meeting at a local law firm with a fire in her eyes. "They want to help," she said, tossing her bag onto the couch. "Pro bono. They believe in what we're building. said the scandal gave them more calls than they can handle, so they're redirecting that momentum into something positive. That's a hell of a shift, James said. We're going to offer legal workshops too, for people who've never had a lawyer, but signed important documents anyway. I want to teach them what I didn't know. James poured them both coffee. You're turning this into something real. She looked at him. So are you? He shrugged. I just keep the lights on. No, she said. You lit the match. They toasted quietly, clinking mismatched mugs in the kitchen that had once seemed too quiet for two people. As winter settled, the Walker House Foundation launched its first program. Emily gave a talk at the local community center. It wasn't recorded. There were no microphones. Just 25 young adults sitting on folding chairs, listening as she explained the dangers of contracts, the power of self-worth, and the value of second chances. Afterward, one girl lingered behind. She couldn't have been older than 19. I thought I was the only one dumb enough to fall for someone who smiled like they knew everything, she said. You weren't dumb, Emily told her. You were hopeful. That's not a crime. It's just something that needs better armor. James watched from the back of the room as his daughter handed the girl a business card, then a hug. He didn't need to hear the rest. He already knew they were rebuilding, not from ruins, but from truth, not as victims, but as architects of something better. By the time spring returned to Ohio, the memory of the wedding had shifted from scandal to lesson. The headlines faded. The analysts moved on. New stories emerged in the media cycle, as they always did. But for those who had lived through it, who had stood under the weight of it, the effects remained, not as wounds, but as a strange kind of clarity. James stood outside his garage one morning, coffee in hand, watching a group of teenagers file into the workshop. Walker House had launched a new program, one part apprenticeship, one part mentorship. High school seniors from nearby counties came every week to learn the basics of mechanics, budgeting, job readiness. Some of them would go into trade schools. Others would head to college. A few would probably leave town the first chance they got. But for now, they were here, safe, learning something useful. James wasn't teaching all of them. He didn't need to. He was just a man who opened a door. Inside, Emily was sitting on a bench in the office area, her laptop open beside a stack of forms. She was dressed simply, jeans and a navy sweater, hair tied back. Her phone buzzed, but she ignored it. She had learned to filter out the noise. A year ago, she would have answered every call, every message, every invitation. Now she only picked up what mattered. Another donation came in, she said, looking up as James walked in. From who? Anonymous, she said. $25,000. Earmarked for expansion. James raised an eyebrow. You think it's guilt money? Emily shrugged. I think someone saw something good and wanted to help without being seen. He nodded. Smart person. She smiled. We'll use it right. Later that afternoon, James drove to the community center, where Walker House was hosting its first official donor event. Nothing extravagant. Just a small gathering of supporters, board members, and a few reporters from local outlets who had been following the foundation's progress. No tuxedos. No catered speeches. Just folding chairs, a potluck table, and photos of the students they'd already helped. When James entered the room, no one stood. No one clapped. But several people turned and gnawed at him to smile. Emily was already speaking to a group near the back, explaining how the foundation planned to partner with trade unions and offer scholarships to underrepresented youth in engineering and design. He stood near the wall, as always, preferring the edge of the crowd. A few people approached him over the course of the evening. One man thanking him for helping his daughter believe in herself again. A woman who asked if he considered sharing his story at a local school. He agreed to both without hesitation. At the end of the night, Emily walked in front of the room, a microphone in her hand, and asked for a moment of quiet. I know this isn't a gala, she began, and we don't have any dramatic lights or orchestras to set the mood, but I think that's fitting, because everything we built here didn't come from spectacle. It came from loss, from humility, from starting over. The room was silent, not tense, just attentive. A little over a year ago, I was standing at an altar, convinced that I had it all figured out, that if I looked the part, if I played it right, I could control everything. But what I learned that day and in the months after was that you don't find strength in control. You find it in honesty, in admitting what you missed, in rebuilding from the ground up. She looked at her father, and sometimes the person you once thought didn't understand you at all turns out to be the one who saw you most clearly. James didn't move. He didn't smile, but his eyes never left hers. I owe everything I am today to the lessons I never wanted to learn, Emily said, and to the man who never let me disappear into someone else's version of my future. She stepped back. The applause was gentle, warm, real. When the event ended, James lingered near the exit, speaking to a few attendees, helping fold chairs. Emily came over and handed him a box of leftover cookies. "You think we're doing all right?" she asked. "I think you're just getting started." They walked to the truck together, the night cool but not cold. The stars were out and full above them, sharp and quiet. James loaded the box into the back seat and paused before climbing in. "Funny thing," he said, leaning against the door. "What's that?" "I spent so long thinking I had to prove myself to people like Charles, like your mother, like the whole damn world." Emily looked at him, and it turns out I didn't need to be richer. I just needed to be right. She nodded. "You were." They drove home without saying much else. The road was dark but familiar. The trees arched overhead like an old memory. Somewhere far away, the Hawthorns were still trying to manage the fallout. Charles had been indicted on 3 counts of fraud, with hearings scheduled for the following quarter. Publicly, he had vanished. No interviews, no appearances, no statements. James didn't follow the case closely. He didn't need to. At home, Emily sat by the window, sorting through grant proposals and volunteer applications. James cooked dinner, something simple. They ate in silence, not from discomfort, but from peace. Afterward, James stepped outside again, sitting on the porch swing with a blanket and a worn-out paperback. He read a few pages, then set the book down, staring out into the night. He thought about everything he had lost, the years after the divorce, the missed birthdays, the photos he hadn't been in, and he thought about what he'd gained, this house, this porch, this second chance. In the end, no one handed him a trophy. No camera caught his best moments. He wasn't rich by the world's standards, but he had his name, his daughter, a quiet place to call home, and the knowledge that when the time came to stand up, he hadn't backed down. He had stood tall, spoken true, and because of that, he was, in all the ways that counted, the richest man in the room.